Hey there, Pastor Kevin. Just thinking about some of the things that are taking place in our nation today, and thinking about the things that have taken place in our nation over the last 10 years or so. At least the last 10 years I've been paying attention, let me say that. And I'm still trying to reckon these things and understand how we got here. But more than contemplating and digging around and finding out how we got here, what we need to ask, I think personally, maybe I don't need to say we, maybe I just need to say me, what I need to think is not so much how we got here as much as we are here and how do we move forward from here. And so there are some guideposts that I use when I'm processing things like this, when I'm thinking about um, tragedy, or I'm thinking about hate. It's hard to process. I agree with you. But what I want to bring out to your attention is really a difference, and then I want to give you an illustration how I process and think through this. So the first thing is the difference. There is a difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is I can sympathize with you because I've experienced what you experience. So, for example, I can sympathize with a young married couple who has a newborn infant who will not sleep through the night. I can sympathize with you because I've experienced that. I know what it feels like. I know what it's like to not get very much sleep. I know what it's like to have to get up the next morning and work even though you haven't had much sleep. And you're thinking about that night going back home after work and putting that baby back to bed and not getting any more sleep. And yet the next day is going to roll in, the next day is going to roll in. And I can sympathize with a man or even with a woman really that has an infant child who won't sleep through the night. I can sympathize with you. But empathy is different than experience. Empathy is, even though I haven't experienced what you've experienced, I seek and endeavor to put myself in your situation. So, for example, if someone comes to me and they say, I got a 18-year-old daughter, and I don't know how to parent her. She's out of control. I can't sympathize with you because I don't have an 18-year-old daughter. My daughter's 11, so in 7 years I'll be able to sympathize with you. But empathy is when I look at your situation and I try to walk in your shoes. I try to understand what you're going through. I try to understand your experience even though I haven't had the experience. So sympathy is walking in the shoes of someone else. Sympathy is I've experienced what you've experienced. I've walked where you walk. I know what it feels like. I know what it is to think that way. I understand you. Okay. Empathy is I've not walked where you are. I don't know what it feels like, but I really want to know. I really want to because I value you. I want to understand you. And so I think that's the difference here, sympathy and empathy. Now, here's the illustration for you. I'm a Christian. I believe the gospel of Jesus. And so that's the guidepost. For me, that's how I reconcile, that's how I understand sympathy, it's how I understand empathy. The writer of Hebrews said in chapter 4 that Jesus is able to sympathize with us because he experienced the human experience. So he's able to uh, sympathize with us because he experienced it. Here's a man who looked at someone who was completely different. I mean, if you think about Jesus, Jesus is completely different than the people he came to rescue. He's totally different from the people he came to rescue. Jesus is perfect. The people he came to rescue are not perfect. Jesus is divine. The people he came to rescue are sinful. Jesus is royalty. Jesus came to save people who are not royal. If Jesus looked at us and said, they're different than me, I'm not going to go to them, we would be in a world of trouble. We would be in a lot of trouble. But here's a man who looked at people absolutely different than him. And he came to them, took up a human form, so that he could sympathize with them. That's the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus took on human form, and he's able to sympathize with us in our human experience. And he did that in a perfect life. And through that perfect life, he earned righteous standing so that we have a righteous standing before God because of his grace. And then Jesus, in that human form, goes to the cross and he dies for our imperfection. You got to remember, he comes to a people that are different than he is. No similarities. Really, there's no commonalities. But he came to people who are different in order to redeem them, in order to reconcile them, in order to bring them back into the fold. If that's the gospel, then gospel believers must look at people who are different than them. And even though I can't go out and be a cop today. I can't understand what they go through. I can't go out and be a young African American man. I can't. I have an inability. I can't sympathize because I can't experience what those two groups experience. But because of the gospel, because Jesus shows me that guidepost in the gospel where he went to people who are different in an attempt to understand, in an attempt, of course, the ultimate goal there was to redeem and to reconcile. As a believer, I've got to take the gospel and I've got to say I can't sympathize with those two categories of people that I just said, but I can seek to empathize with them. I can seek and endeavor to put myself in their shoes to understand them. And the way that you do that is you look at people who are different than you and you listen. And you listen. I don't know what's going on in our country. When do we get to the point where we don't listen to each other? You can't have a conversation. It's almost like the media, and I'm not blaming the media, but it's almost like if you get your news from the TV, their ratings thrive on emotional sensationalism. Where are the good stories? Where are the good things that are going on? What about the protests that haven't turned violent? Where are they in your report? What about the 98% of cops who go into lower socioeconomic neighborhoods and shoot basketball with the kids? It doesn't drive ratings. And again, I'm not blaming the media. I'm just simply saying to you, you can't let the media or anybody like the media frame your understanding of these issues. You have to seek to empathize with those who are different. And it starts in your community. I don't live in Baton Rouge. I don't live in Dallas. I don't live in Memphis. I live where I live. And there are people where I live who are different than me. And so I've got to go to them and empathize with them, try to understand. And in turn, they've got to do that to me in order for reconciliation to take place. Reconciliation is not going to take place if there's no listening and there's an assumption about the person who's different. The gospel teaches us better than that. The gospel teaches us better than that. The gospel says that Jesus looked at people different. Different. And he came to them. And while it's not a one-to-one, because Jesus didn't come to us to listen to us, Jesus came to experience what we experienced, to reconcile us. And now he's entrusted to us as Christians the message of reconciliation. I think that message is going to start when you look at people who are different than you. You listen to them. You ask them questions. You listen. You don't have to agree, but you need to understand where they're coming from. And you might just see that there's a lot more in common with that person who looks different than you really thought. In fact, the way I've told my church multiple times is that where we live, my church is predominantly Caucasian. I've told them 100 gazillion times, you have more in common with a black Christian in this town than you do a white non-Christian. As soon as you die, you'll never see that white non-Christian again. As soon as you die, you're going to spend eternity with that black Christian. You have more in common with a black Christian than you do the people in your own neighborhood. So think through that. Think through it. Just because they're different doesn't mean they're bad. Just because they're different doesn't mean that they're not valuable. That's good. Have a great day. God bless you.